Yeah, good morning. And this morning we're going to be talking around adult ADHD, standing for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, but we usually just call it ADHD because there are some issues with the terminology, but the name has sort of stuck. And I'm going to be particularly focusing on the DSM V criteria, which has changed from the DSM IV. And we have in South Africa a guideline that was actually brought out for adult ADHD in 2017 by the Society of Psychiatrists. And so from a treatment point of view, I'm going to be focusing on that. At the moment, there is no treatment options for adult ADHD in the STG and EML, for example. It's all focused around children. So what we're going to be covering today is I'm going to look a little bit at going into quite a bit of detail on understanding what ADHD looks like. Before we actually cover the diagnostic criteria, because the diagnostic criteria in itself actually is not a very good way of understanding ADHD, because it's very much just based on what one can observe. And then we'll talk a little bit about the treatment as well. So what do we mean when we talk about ADHD? And it's now recognized as part of a wide range of neurodiversity, including things like autism and dyslexia, etc. And classically, it's divided into three groups, and we'll go into that into quite a bit of detail today. So in the DSM as well, when you diagnose somebody with ADHD, you can have somebody with inattentive type or somebody with hyperactive impulsive type. And already there you can see, or a combination of the two, that there's a challenge in terms of the terminology, because we talk about attention deficit, and actually it's usually not a deficit in attention. It's more to do with the way attention takes place. And not all people with ADHD has the hyperactivity component. And therefore, there is still a lot of confusion about what ADHD looks like in adults. The important thing is that to be able for it to be diagnosed or to be given a diagnosis, according to DSM, it obviously has to have a significant impact on an individual's academic, work, social, or daily activities. So depending on their particular life story. And ADHD is one of the neurodiverse conditions that actually is amenable to treatment. And we'll look a little bit today at why that is and how it is. But this is a lifelong condition. It's a kind of neural wiring that one is born with. So in terms of epidemiology, so from global stats, it's considered the most common psychiatric disorder in school-age children. So in terms of disorders that we use the DSM to diagnose, so up to 16% in some studies. And classically, and this has always been interesting, when we diagnose it in children, it's usually diagnosed more in boys and girls. But when you look at the statistic in adults, you find that the ratio between men and women with ADHD is about the same. And the reason for that is that we are actually missing quite a large number of girls with ADHD and diagnosing them with other things. So classically in the literature, they say 60 or 70% of symptoms persist into adulthood, but ADHD is not something you outgrow, but it might be something that you learn to manage. So depending on your life, you might be able to create a life in which your ADHD is actually a real advantage and a benefit, where for some people, ADHD can become a real barrier. And that's why quite often it's not so, some children who have had ADHD might be able to manage without medication when they are adults. Just in terms of South Africa, so SADC has identified about 1 million people between the ages of 20 and 50 that has been classified and diagnosed according to the DSM with adult ADHD. And that puts our prevalence in adults in South Africa, and that's what we assume it is somewhere between 2.5 to 4.3%. And it might even be higher because there might be people that have not actually been diagnosed. Important is that a very high percentage, and there's difference, but in this particular study that SADC did, 20.4% of them had a comorbid mental health condition. So if you are seeing patients with depression or anxiety, some of them might also have ADHD underlying. So let's just look a little bit at understanding the pathophysiology. And it's important to understand that it's a heritable condition. So if one parent has it, there's a risk of a child having it of 1 in 3. If both parents have it, a risk of as much as 2 in 3. And it's a neurochemical condition. So when we spoke about autism, we spoke about the way people process information. So it has to do with the neural networks, where actually this has got very much to do with the neuropeptides that are bringing messages. And the two major ones it's affected is dopamine and norepinephrine in particular parts of the brain, which we'll look at in a minute. What's interesting is it's not that the neuropeptides are not there at all. The problem is more that they're not firing consistently. So it's more about the flow of these chemicals rather than the amount. So this affects behavior in 3 different ways. And this particular way of organizing it is actually from my perspective, because quite often the focus is only on attention and activity. But actually, there's also quite a large component of how it affects, of its effect on executive function. So we're going to look at these 3 different areas: attention and perception, executive function, and activity and impulsivity. So there's quite a lot of debate around the fact that people call it a disorder. I think the name will probably stick because it is something that we prescribe treatment for. And then the other sort of side is where some people say, well, it's a bit of a superpower, you know, ADHD. It has these extraordinary creative possibilities. And I think it's sort of a middle way. It's not completely a disorder. It's not entirely an asset as well. It is something that brings its own challenges. So let's just look a little bit and go back to some basic neurophysiology of how attention works. So this is the neurotypical brain. And when we are busy through our daily lives, we are either paying attention or we're not paying attention. And there are 2 different networks that sort of switch between each other. So the one on the right there is like they call the task positive network, or the TPN network. And you can think of this like a busy bee, like a bee that's visiting flower to flower to flower and has a very focused attention. So this kicks in whenever we are paying attention, for example, to reading a book or doing a puzzle, or when you're busy with solving a problem. And this network is responsible for activating and maintaining attention. When we are not having to pay attention to something, we go into what they call default domain mode, or the DNM mode. And that's your daydreamer sort of system. So this is in the system where you sort of, your mind is wandering a bit. This is where we're quite creative. We make all kinds of different connections. And this part of the network is very much connected both to our frontal lobes and our forward thinking. So we fantasize and dream about the future, but it also links to our autobiographical memory. So we might ruminate and brood and think about the past. So it's sort of that inner chatterbox that we have. The way these 2 areas are controlled, the way we decide, am I paying attention or am I not paying attention, has got 2 important networks involved. There's our executive prefrontal cortex, which you can think of the manager. This is the part that organizes and plans and decides what we need to do, and therefore decides when we need to pay attention or not. And then there's something called the salience network, which has got which is the actual switch to decide at which point do I pay attention or not. And that switch is very much run by dopamine. So if you think of our dopamine reward system, whenever we are needing to either keep ourselves safe or we need to follow a particular drive, this network gets activated. So for example, if you walk into a room and there's a lovely buffet laid out, you know, one of those nice cocktail buffets. And when you've walked in, you were sort of, you know, mind wandering, daydreaming, thinking about other things, and you walk in, but you're quite hungry. So suddenly dopamine will give you get a little flash of dopamine, and you become very interested in the dinner table, and you pick up your little plate, and now you're going to pick what you're going to be having. You pick all your favorite food, and then you sit back and you go back into mind wandering mode while you eat. So that sort of switching between those 2 modes happen very, very automatically through our dopamine reward system. Our attention is very strongly linked to our engine or our activity. So the idea of paying attention to something like at the dinner table is being able to see something that you want to need to do. You're hungry, you focus on the food, and then you will move towards the food and actually go and get yourself some. So this gets mediated by things like our basal ganglia, our cerebellum, and various other systems. So that's a little bit on how attention works. What happens with the ADHD brain is particularly on this higher level. So there's a bit of an underactive manager, so less prefrontal cortex activity in terms of executive planning. And it has a glitchy switch. And we call it a glitchy switch because it's not that that there is no switch or that the dopamine is not working. It's just that there's not this smooth movement between daydream and focus. And so actually in the ADHD brain, we get 3 potential spaces they might be in. The one on the right here is what I call the hyperdream, and they actually can get stuck, and especially an inattentive ADHD, within this very fantastical inner world daydream. And when you look at them, they will seem very inattentive when they're in those. We're going to go in those a little bit detail. On the other side, there also is the possibility of actually getting stuck within the TPN, within that focused attention side, and actually have a hyperfocus. So being able to concentrate on something to the exclusion of everything else. But what's interesting is that, and they've shown this on functional MRIs, is that ADHD people also has this possibility to have both the DMN and the TPN on at the same time. So they're aware of everything out there and they're aware of everything inside, but they're also bringing focused attention, like lots of little busy bees. So it becomes like a hive of bees within that attention. So if they are more in DMN mode, it will translate to hypoactivity, and they might not actually move at all. Or if they're in hyperfocus or in the scattered focus frame of mind, that might actually translate into hyperactivity or impulsivity. And don't worry, we're going to go through that in more detail. So this gives us now the possibility, as we've looked at the pathophysiology of ADHD, we can now try and imagine a little